Welcome, dear listener, to a most curious case in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead. Here, behind lace curtains and rose gardens, secrets bloom as readily as the hollyhocks. In this story, our sharp-eyed Miss Marple finds herself unraveling a web of whispers surrounding an elderly widow's final words. Words that may conceal a most shocking truth. Chapter 1. The Widow's Last Words. It was one of those gentle September afternoons in St. Mary Mead, when the air seemed touched with honey and the sound of bees carried lazily through cottage gardens. The village, though small and tucked away, had a peculiar way of being both utterly tranquil and endlessly full of talk. Roses still clung to their trellises, dahlias flamed in cottage borders, and the winding lane toward the church carried with it a faint scent of wood smoke from the first autumn fires. Miss Jane Marple, sitting by the window of her prim yet comfortable sitting room, threaded her embroidery needle with fine cotton. Her work, a delicate spray of forget-me-nots on a linen handkerchief, was progressing neatly. She paused occasionally to glance outside, where her neighbor, Mrs. Weatherby, was instructing a young maid in the art of hanging sheets properly upon a line. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, sharp as ever, noted the maid's careless pegs and Mrs. Weatherby's fluttering gestures. Not unlike life itself, Miss Marple mused, the young so often careless of detail, while the old cannot help but observe them. Her reflections were interrupted by a knock at the door, an eager, almost fluttering knock. When she rose and opened it, there stood Mrs. Dolly Bantry, wife of the local colonel and Miss Marple's closest friend. Dolly was flushed from walking briskly, her hat slightly askew, her voice pitched high with importance. "Jane," she said without preamble, "you've heard the news, I suppose?" Miss Marple gave her the faintest smile. "I find it is rarely safe to assume, Dolly. News has so many shapes and sizes. Do come in." The two ladies settled themselves in the parlor, where in silence for a moment, broken only by the ticking of the small clock on the mantelpiece. Mrs. Bantry, unable to contain herself, burst out, "Well, Jane, what do you make of it? Surely it must mean something. Why on earth should she call for you? She had family after all. Edward Price, that dreadful nephew, and that fluttering cousin of hers. But you, well, she hardly ever came to tea with us, did she? Not exactly neighborly." Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "People have the oddest confidences, Dolly. They may pass over those they know too well, preferring instead someone quite apart, whom they perceive as trustworthy. You see, one is less likely to be entangled." She sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. "An accident," she said. "That is very suggestive. And a will. And the garden key. It is always interesting when the simplest objects are given emphasis at the very last." Mrs. Bantry shivered with delight, as she always did when some mystery was afoot. "It sounds positively like one of those dreadful detective novels. I half expect Colonel Melchett to come knocking with handcuffs." "Let us not anticipate, Dolly," Miss Marple replied gently. "Deathbed words can be muddled, of course, but equally they can be sharp and clear, sharper than ever before, because there is no longer time to dissemble." That afternoon, Miss Marple walked quietly through the village, her knitting bag over her arm. At every corner she was greeted with solemn nods, whispers, and speculative glances. St. Mary Mead was in mourning, yes, but also in a ferment of curiosity. Mrs. Price had been a formidable woman. The widow of a wealthy industrialist, she had settled at Hawthorne Lodge 20 years earlier. Her fortune was considerable, her opinions uncompromising, and her tongue sharp enough to curdle cream. She had quarreled with neighbors, bullied tradesmen, and commanded her household with an iron hand. Yet she was respected, even feared, and in the strange alchemy of village life, that respect shaded into a I'd wager. If he doesn't get a slice of the pie, he'll be ruined. Passing the surgery, Miss Marple noted the drawn curtains. Dr. Leonard Hale, the family physician, was said to have been in constant attendance during Mrs. Price's final weeks. A tall man with thinning hair, he was usually genial, but of late his manner had grown harried. Villagers murmured of unpaid bills and whispered consultations. And at the vicarage, Miss Marple paused to greet Reverend Julian Harper, a kindly man in his early 50s. He spoke in subdued tones of Mrs. Price's passing, and though he expressed sympathy, Miss Marple detected a certain relief behind his spectacles. Mrs. Price had been a most exacting parishioner, with very decided ideas on the proper conduct of sermons, bazaars, and charitable giving. Ah, Miss Marple thought as she resumed her walk. Already the players assemble, each with their little motives, their little secrets. That evening, Miss Marple received another visitor, this time the nurse who had attended Mrs. Price at her deathbed, Nurse Ellison. A sensible, practical woman in her 30s, she came straight from the lodge, still in her uniform. "I thought you ought to know, Miss Marple," she said earnestly. "It troubled me what Mrs. Price said at the very end. She was weak, of course, but her eyes, oh, they were bright as anything. She clutched my hand and said, 'It wasn't an accident. Tell Jane Marple. The will. The garden key.' Then she fell back, and that was the end." "Thank you, Nurse Ellison," Miss Marple said gently. "It was kind of you to come." "I dare say it doesn't mean anything," the nurse added, though her tone suggested she very much hoped it did. "But she was most insistent. I've repeated her words exactly as best I can." "You did quite right," Miss Marple assured her. "The exact words are always important. People so often paraphrase, and in doing so lose the clue." The nurse departed, and Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly. She thought of the widow's words, turning them over like pieces of a puzzle. It wasn't, and the village prepared for a funeral. But in the quiet of her parlor, Miss Marple knew that Mrs. Price's death was not the end of the story at all. It was, in truth, the beginning. Chapter 2. The Gathering of Suspects. The day following Mrs. Price's death dawned gray and cool, with a mist that clung stubbornly to the hedgerows. St. Mary Mead had put on its solemn face, yet beneath the surface, one could almost hear the hum of speculation. Death in a village is never merely death. It is also a disturbance to the intricate web of relationships, expectations, and whispered stories that knit together daily life. At Hawthorne Lodge, the imposing red brick residence of the late widow, preparations for the reading of the will were underway. Miss Marple, having received a polite, though somewhat surprised invitation from the solicitor, Mr. Graves, set out in her neat gray coat and hat, gloves buttoned at the wrist, her knitting bag tucked under one arm. As she walked, she reflected on the curious assortment of people who would inevitably gather. Mrs. Price had been a woman of wealth and consequence, and where there is money, there are always those who hope or expect to benefit. The gravel drive of Hawthorne Lodge crunched beneath Miss Marple's sensible shoes. The house itself loomed, with ivy climbing up one wing and the heavy curtains drawn against the morning chill. At the great oak door, Clara Simmons, the housekeeper, admitted her with stiff formality. Clara Simmons, the loyal servant. Clara was a tall, angular woman in her 50s, her gray hair drawn back in a severe bun, her black dress starched and immaculate. She had served Mrs. Price for 2 decades and wore her loyalty like armor. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, inclining her head. "Mr. Graves is in the drawing room with the family." Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in the woman's hands as she accepted her umbrella. Clara's face was composed, but her eyes were reddened, as though from a sleepless night. "A sad occasion," Miss Marple murmured gently. "Yes, indeed. Mrs. Price was kind. A great loss for you, I am sure." Edward gave a careless shrug. Yes, quite, though one mustn't dwell. Life goes on, does it not? Especially in London, where business awaits." Miss Marple's gaze rested on his cufflinks, gold but slightly tarnished, and on his shoes, which, though polished, were worn thin at the sole, the signs of a man living beyond his means. She tucked the observation away for later. Violet Green, the distant cousin. Seated near the window was Miss Violet Green, a distant cousin. She was a prim woman of about 40, her clothing modest but chosen with an eye to refinement. She wore a small pearl brooch at her collar and held a lace handkerchief that she dabbed frequently to her eyes, though no tears seemed forthcoming. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said tremulously, "how dreadful all this is. Poor dear Mrs. Price. She was always so generous to me, always said she wished me to be comfortable." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though she remembered distinctly that Mrs. Price had once referred to Violet as that grasping little greenfinch. Violet leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I do hope the will is straightforward. It can be such an unpleasant business, don't you think, when families quarrel? Not that I should expect anything, of course. Only a trifle, perhaps, as a remembrance." Miss Marple gave her the faintest of smiles. "One never knows, dear. Surprises do occur." Dr. Leonard Hale, the physician. The physician, Dr. Leonard Hale, arrived late, apologizing with professional gravity. He was a tall man, his frame slightly stooped, his hair thinning at the crown. He shook hands with the solicitor, murmured condolences, and took a seat at the far end of the room. Miss Marple studied him discreetly. He looked pale, with shadows beneath his eyes, and when he removed his gloves, his fingers trembled faintly. A man under strain, she thought. Yet when Violet Green asked anxiously whether Mrs. Price had suffered, he assured her smoothly, "She passed very peacefully indeed, quite without pain." The words were calm, but Miss Marple noticed how he avoided looking directly at Edward Price, and how he shifted up. Solicitor cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. He was a thin man with an air of pedantic precision. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are here for the reading of the last will and testament of the late Mrs. Agatha Price. This document, signed 6 months ago, supersedes all previous versions." A hush fell upon the room. Edward Price leaned forward. Violet Green dabbed her eyes again. Clara Simmons stood very still by the tea tray, and Dr. Hale clasped his hands together tightly. Mr. Graves read aloud. "To my nephew, Edward Price, I bequeath the sum of £200. To my cousin, Violet Green, the sum of £100. To my faithful housekeeper, Clara Simmons, the contents of her bedroom and personal effects, as a token of my gratitude." Edward's mouth fell open slightly. Violet let out a small gasp. Clara stood stiff as a poker, her face unreadable. "And the remainder of my estate, including Hawthorne Lodge and all investments," the solicitor continued, "I leave to the National Trust for War Widows to be used in providing homes and assistance for those who lost husbands in the late conflict." There was a stunned silence. Edward sprang to his feet. "This is absurd, utterly absurd. My aunt would never have disinherited me in this fashion." "Nevertheless," Mr. Graves said primly, "the document is properly witnessed and signed. Unless there is evidence to the contrary, it is valid." Violet Green fluttered her handkerchief. "But surely there must be some mistake. I had always thought—" Dr. Hale cleared his throat nervously but said nothing. Clara Simmons pressed her lips together, her eyes glinting strangely. And Miss Marple, seated quietly by the fire, folded her hands in her lap. "So," she thought, "that is the matter of the will. And now the question becomes, who stands to gain, who stands to lose, and who might fear discovery?" Quiet observations. The gathering broke into murmurs, Edward storming about the room. "Wasn't an accident. The will. The garden key." She had now seen the family, the household, and the solicitor. She had heard the will, but the other pieces of the puzzle remained shadowy. "Very well," she murmured softly as she turned the key in her own garden gate. "If Mrs. Price has chosen me as her confessor, I shall do my best to be worthy of the trust. For in St. Mary Mead, even the smallest remark may conceal the greatest of truths." Chapter 3. A Puzzle in the Will. The day after the reading of the will, the village was abuzz in a way only St. Mary Mead could be. At the grocer's counter, Mrs. Archer declared in tones of indignation that she had always suspected Mrs. Price of being queer in the head, and that no right-minded woman would leave a fine house to strangers instead of her own kin. At the post office, the clerks exchanged whispers about Edward Price's fury, his voice having carried all too clearly from the drawing room. At the butcher's, Miss Violet Green's fluttering lamentations were retold with relish. "Poor thing, she's only got £100. Why, that won't even see her through a year if she carries on with her tea-shop luncheons and new hats." Miss Marple, sitting serenely in her usual pew at morning service, heard these whispers with half an ear. She had learned long ago that people often revealed more in gossip than in formal statements. Beneath every judgment, there was a fragment of fact, and beneath every complaint, a kernel of truth. Mrs. Price's will, with its charitable bequest, had startled everyone. But it was not so much the charity itself that caused disquiet. St. Mary Mead was accustomed to occasional eccentric gifts to churches or missions. But the sense that something about this arrangement felt contrived, hasty, or perhaps concealed. After the service, the solicitor, Mr. Graves, lingered in the churchyard, his tall frame stiff and precise as he accepted condolences. Miss Marple, pausing to examine a headstone with feigned interest, overheard him speaking. Some event must have compelled her. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple accepted an invitation for tea at Hawthorne Lodge. Clara Simmons, the housekeeper, received her with a manner that was both courteous and guarded. Clara had the air of one who carried burdens silently, and Miss Marple, who was adept at drawing out confidences, spoke only of small matters. The dahlias in her garden, the shortage of good tea since the war, The trouble of keeping lace curtains free of soot from the chimneys. At last, Clara softened and offered a little more. "It is all so unsettled, Miss Marple," she said, pouring the tea with a steady hand, though her lips trembled. "We had all thought, well, I had thought, that Mrs. Price would leave her affairs as she had always said. But now, this trust, it changes everything." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Change is often difficult, particularly when it comes unexpectedly. Tell me, my dear, did Mrs. Price speak much of her intentions in recent weeks?" Clara's eyes flickered. She was restless. "Yes, restless, that is the word. She had me bring down her papers more than once, and she kept asking after the garden keys. A peculiar fancy, I thought, for she had not stepped foot in the walled garden these 10 years. It was too damp for her chest, she said. But she asked nonetheless, and when I went to fetch them, one was gone. I have all the keys here on my chain, as you see, but the small iron one for the garden door, it was missing." Miss Marple looked at her mildly. "That is most curious. And you have no idea who might have taken it?" Clara shook her head firmly. "No one but myself and Mrs. Price ever touched the keys. I never left them unattended. Unless—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Unless?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "Well, Dr. Hale had the run of the house of late. He was here nearly every day." "But what would a doctor want with a garden key?" Miss Marple did not answer. She only sipped her tea, her eyes thoughtful. That evening, unable to quiet her mind, Miss Marple walked by the lodge once more. The mist had thickened, and the garden walls loomed like ancient sentinels. Earth had been disturbed. Near the bird bath she bent, prodding gently with her umbrella tip. Something metallic scraped against the stone base. Clara, watching uneasily, exclaimed, "What are you doing, Miss Marple?" "Only admiring how cleverly ivy conceals things," Miss Marple said serenely. She tugged at a loose stone beneath the bird bath, and there, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small tin. The clasp was rusted, but with effort it opened. Inside were fragments of paper, scorched and brittle, as if someone had tried to burn them but had not succeeded entirely. Miss Marple examined them with care. On one fragment a line of writing remained. "Witness to this will." On another, barely legible, were the words, "Signed this day of." Clara gasped. "Good heavens, it's a will, or part of one." Miss Marple folded the scraps carefully. "It appears so. A copy, perhaps, hidden here, then later destroyed, though not quite thoroughly. Very strange, do you not think?" Clara's face was pale. "But why hide a will in the garden? Why not keep it in the desk or with the solicitor?" "That," said Miss Marple, slipping the tin into her bag, "is the very question, my dear." Why indeed? When she returned home, Miss Marple sat quietly by her fire, her knitting in her lap. Her mind ticked gently, like the clock upon the mantel. She thought of Mrs. Price's final words. It wasn't an accident. Tell Jane Marple. The will. The garden key. Already the picture began to form. Mrs. Price had feared something. Feared perhaps that her testament might be challenged or destroyed. So she had hidden it in the most unlikely of places, beneath a stone in her forgotten garden. But someone else had discovered it, and in haste or desperation, had tried to burn it. The scraps remained as mute witnesses. And what of the accident? Was it connected to this hidden will? Or was it another matter entirely, some long-ago event whose shadow still lingered? Miss Marple sighed softly. She knew only this. Mrs. Price had not spoken idly. Her words, having observed humanity in all its guises, was not inclined to take such appearances at face value. She paid her call the following morning under the mild pretext of an inquiry about her rheumatism, which occasionally obliged her to walk with her cane. The waiting room was comfortably furnished with chintz chairs, though the magazines on the table were out of date by several years. A small boy with a scraped knee sat fidgeting beside his mother, while Mrs. Weatherby coughed discreetly into a handkerchief in the corner. When her turn came, Miss Marple was ushered into the consulting room, which smelled faintly of antiseptic and pipe tobacco. Dr. Hale rose politely, his dark hair brushed back, his expression composed. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said with professional warmth. "And how are you keeping these days? Nothing too troubling, I trust?" "Only the usual stiffness in my joints," Miss Marple replied, seating herself with her knitting bag upon her lap. "The damp weather does aggravate it so, though I find that a hot water bottle is quite as effective as any of those modern liniments." Dr. Hale smiled thinly. "Quite so. Sometimes the simplest remedies are the best." He made a note upon his pad, more for form's sake than necessity. "Was that your only concern?" "Well," Miss Marple said gently, "there is another matter. You see, I was at Hawthorne Lodge the other afternoon, paying a call upon Clara Simmons. Such a capable housekeeper, though, between ourselves, I think she has been greatly unsettled by the recent events." Dr. Hale's hand paused in mid-scribble. "Naturally. The passing of Mrs. Price has been a shock to us all." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "Particularly since she was in your care, was she not? I understand you saw her very frequently in the weeks before her death." The doctor's eyes, though calm, betrayed a flicker of unease. "She had a weak heart, Miss Marple. I advised her to rest, to avoid strain. I attended her as often as she required." "And yet," Miss Marple said mildly, "she seemed troubled." Gave a short laugh. "I rode when I was a younger man. Not much opportunity these days." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Ah, well, I was curious, you see, for I noticed a footprint by the garden gate at the lodge. A man's shoe, with a very particular notch in the heel, rather like the pair you are wearing now." The doctor shifted in his chair, then rose abruptly and crossed to the window. "Really, Miss Marple, I hope you are not suggesting—" "I suggest nothing at all," Miss Marple said with a placid smile. "I merely observe. It is a harmless old habit of mine. You must forgive me." There was silence for a moment, broken only by the faint clink of china from the surgery kitchen. Then Dr. Hale turned back, his manner composed once more. "You are a shrewd observer, Miss Marple. But you mistake the matter. I was at the lodge, yes, but with good reason. Mrs. Price requested that I fetch her some lavender oil from the garden. She believed it helped her sleep. Clara was out, and I did not wish to disturb her when she returned. That is why I had the key." "How thoughtful of you," Miss Marple murmured. "Entirely proper, I assure you. I would not have you or anyone misinterpret my intentions." Miss Marple rose, gathering her things. "Of course not, Doctor. You are most conscientious." As she made her way down the high street afterwards, she considered what she had learned. Dr. Hale had indeed been in the garden. He admitted as much. But his explanation was curiously rehearsed, as though prepared in anticipation of questions. And Miss Marple, who had lived too long to overlook such subtleties, tucked the detail away for future reflection. That afternoon, she was visited at her cottage by Inspector Cray, the police officer newly posted to the district. A solid, dependable man in his 40s, Cray was not unkind, but sometimes slow to see beyond the obvious. He respected Miss Marple, however, for he had already heard tales of her uncanny knack for unraveling village tangles. "Good day, Miss Marple." Yes. Frightened, perhaps, but not confused. Indeed, her last words were very deliberate. It wasn't an accident. Tell Jane Marple. The will. The garden key. I can scarcely think she imagined it all. The inspector raised his brows. "You're certain of that?" "Quite certain." Cray rubbed his chin. "Then we must consider the possibility that someone tampered with her affairs." "Have you any suspicion who?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I should not wish to accuse without certainty, but I have gathered one or two threads which may, in time, form a pattern. For instance, did you know that a fragment of a burnt will was concealed in the garden?" The inspector started. "Good heavens! Where is it now?" "In safekeeping," Miss Marple said serenely. "I thought it best not to alarm Clara, but it suggests there was indeed an earlier testament, one someone wished to destroy." Cray frowned. "And who had access to the garden?" "Ah, that is the crux of it. The housekeeper kept the keys carefully, but the doctor admitted to having borrowed one. Edward Price also had opportunity. He was often about the house. Violet Green, too, fluttered in and out, though she seemed scarcely the type. And let us not forget the Reverend, who was often received in the drawing-room for private talks." The inspector muttered, "A tidy circle of suspects, then, and each with a reason. Edward for money, Violet for security, the Reverend for some charitable purpose, perhaps, and the doctor, well, I don't yet see his motive." Miss Marple said nothing, only offered him another slice of seed cake. That evening, word of the destroyed will spread quietly through the village. Speculation grew rampant. At the Blue Boar Inn, Edward Price was overheard railing against meddlesome spinsters who put their noses where they were not wanted. Violet Green confided tearfully to anyone who would listen that she was sure her dear friend had meant to provide for her, but had been led astray by unscrupulous counsel. Reverend Harper maintained a sorrowful silence which some took for dignity and others for guilt. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat by her hearth, knitting needles flashing, murmured, "How very often the most trusted figures are the least questioned. And yet, human nature is ever the same, whether in a great house or a small cottage. Pride, greed, fear, they show themselves in the smallest details. One has only to look." The clock struck 10, the hour growing late. But Miss Marple remained awake, her thoughts quietly at work, untangling the threads of a puzzle that was far from complete. And in the stillness of the night, the words returned to her once more. The will. The garden key. Chapter 5. The Reverend's Burden. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. The mist of the past days lifted as if to allow St. Mary Mead a reprieve from its brooding atmosphere. The church bells rang with their usual cheer, and the village, outwardly, went about its peaceful business. Yet beneath the surface, a sense of unease lingered, like a shadow clinging stubbornly in the corners. Miss Marple, ever observant, saw it in the way the villagers glanced toward Hawthorne Lodge as they passed, their voices lowered when the subject of Mrs. Price arose. Curiosity and speculation were as thick as ivy on the garden wall. The fragments of the burnt will were not yet common knowledge. Inspector Cray had promised discretion, but Miss Marple knew such secrets seldom stayed hidden for long in a place like St. Mary Mead. She had decided that day to call upon Reverend Harper. He was a mild man in his late 50s, with thinning hair and a kindly expression, though behind his eyes there often lurked a trace of worry. His sermons were steady rather than inspiring, yet he was well liked for his quiet diligence, and Mrs. Price, in her final years, had seen him often. Too often, some said, though whether that reflected true confidences or merely the Reverend's pastoral duty was another matter. Miss Marple found him in the vicarage garden, stooping to clip a stubborn hedge. He greeted her warmly, though his hands trembled slightly on the shears. "Miss Marple, what a pleasure. Do come in. I have some tea nearly brewed." She accepted, and soon they were seated in the modest drawing room, where the curtains smelled faintly of lavender and the furniture bore the comfortable wear of long use. The Reverend poured the tea carefully, as though it steadied him to perform some ordinary task. "You have been much occupied of late, Reverend," Miss Marple said gently, after a few pleasantries. "Indeed, indeed," he sighed. Mrs. Price was a generous supporter of our parish. Her passing is a great loss. And now, this business of the will. You were close to her? In a pastoral sense, yes. She confided in me. She was troubled. Mine was wandering. Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "And yet, Reverend, when one hides something in a garden, one generally provides for the means of retrieval. A key, for instance. Did she entrust such a key to you?" The Reverend hesitated, then sighed heavily. "She pressed it upon me one afternoon, quite against my protests. A small iron key, she said it was, to the garden door. I kept it for a day or two, then returned it to her, urging her not to put such burdens upon me. It troubled my conscience, you see. I did not wish to be involved in her worldly affairs. My duty is spiritual." Miss Marple inclined her head. "A very proper sentiment. And yet it places you, does it not, in the curious position of having handled the very key that later went missing." His face tightened. "Are you suggesting?" "I suggest nothing," Miss Marple said serenely. "I merely observe. It is curious how often the smallest objects, keys, scraps of paper, prove central to larger matters." The Reverend's hands fidgeted with his handkerchief. "Miss Marple, I hope you do not think me dishonest. I returned the key, truly I did. And as for Mrs. Price's will, I had no interest in it save that her charitable works might continue. If she chose to leave her fortune elsewhere, so be it. The Lord provides." His words were humble, yet Miss Marple noted the twitch of unease at his mouth. Was it merely guilt at being entangled in worldly affairs, or something deeper? Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Violet Green near the milliner's shop. Violet, in her fluttering lilac hat and gloves that had seen better days, was the picture of fragile dismay. "Oh, Miss Marple," she exclaimed, "have you heard? Edward is beside himself with rage, declares he'll take the matter to court. And the shame of it, the scandal, why I scarcely dare show my face." "People are sympathetic, my dear," Miss Marple soothed. "They understand your position." Violet's eyes welled with tears. "But surely, Miss Marple, you believe Mrs. Price meant to honor." Violet dabbed at her eyes. "Yes, yes, of course. But it is all so cruel. I am left destitute, and others reap the rewards." Miss Marple offered a kindly pat to her arm. But in her mind she noted how Violet's grief was tinged with envy, her lamentations always circling back to her own loss. It was a motive, certainly, if a weak one. That evening, Inspector Cray paid another visit. He was brisk, carrying his notebook with an air of purpose. "We've been looking into Mrs. Price's financial affairs," he told Miss Marple. "Seems she made several large withdrawals in the weeks before her death, quite uncharacteristic. Clara says she kept the money in a locked desk drawer." Miss Marple raised her brows. "And is the money still there?" "No, gone. We've searched the house. Nothing but a few sovereigns in her purse." Miss Marple tapped her needles together thoughtfully. "Then the question is, who had access to that desk?" "Exactly. Clara insists she never touched it. Edward had opportunity, certainly. He was often about. Violet visited frequently, and of course the Reverend, who admitted to being entrusted with other matters. Even the doctor called in her private rooms. Too many possibilities, if you ask me." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "But in puzzles of this kind, one must not be daunted by many threads. They all lead back, eventually, to the same knot." That night Miss Marple sat long by her fire, reflecting. Reverend Harper had admitted to receiving the garden key. Violet hinted darkly at his influence. Edward raged loudly, but without subtlety. And the doctor, calm and evasive, remained her most uneasy puzzle. Yet the burnt will haunted her thoughts most of all. Someone had destroyed it in haste, fearful of what it contained. And that someone had been willing to risk discovery in the very heart of the garden. Miss Marple folded her hands, her eyes glinting. "There is a truth here," she murmured. "A truth buried like a seed beneath the soil. May, Mr. Tilling. Nothing so strong." She settled herself at a small table near the hearth where she could observe without seeming to pry. Edward Price sat at the bar, his large hand wrapped around a glass. He was in conversation with a wiry fellow from the neighboring village, but his words, as usual, carried clearly. "Outrageous, that's what it is," Edward thundered. "My aunt had no business leaving the lodge to some blasted trust. I'm her flesh and blood. It's unnatural, that's what it is, and I'll not rest till I've put the matter right." The wiry man muttered something inaudible, to which Edward replied, "Influence, that's what I suspect. The Reverend's been filling her head with nonsense, or that simpering Violet, though I doubt she's got the brains. Someone's been at her, mark my words." Miss Marple sipped her tea calmly, her ears tuned to the rhythm of his speech. Anger, genuine and unchecked, she could recognize easily. Yet beneath Edward's bluster there was something that rang hollow, as though his fury were a performance meant for an audience. When at last he noticed her presence, he flushed and approached her table. "Ah, Miss Marple, didn't see you there. I suppose you've heard the news about my aunt's disgraceful will." "I was present, Mr. Price," Miss Marple replied mildly. "It must be a great disappointment to you." "Disappointment?" He barked a laugh. "It's a downright robbery. She promised me the lodge a dozen times over, said it was my rightful due. And then this trickery. I'll not stand for it." Miss Marple looked at him with gentle curiosity. "It must have been a shock, certainly. But tell me, did your aunt not confide in you at all in her last days?" "She seemed most anxious, I thought." Edward's brow darkened. "She said little enough to me, always kept me at arm's length. But I know she was troubled. Papers, she kept muttering about. If I'd had the chance, I'd have looked into that desk of hers myself." "Ah, the desk," Miss Marple murmured. "A curious matter, is it not? That the money she withdrew before her death is now missing." Edward's eye, "Then my aunt's health." Miss Marple let the words hang. her mind quietly noting the venom in his tone. Later, as she walked home along the lane, she considered what she had seen. Edward's anger was genuine, but his protestations about money rang suspiciously hollow. His talk of unpaid bills, of promises made, of the lodge as his rightful due, all pointed to motive, and his mention of the desk suggested knowledge he should not have had. Had he searched it already, or did he merely wish others to think so? That evening, Clara Simmons came to Miss Marple's cottage with a basket of eggs from her hens. She was pale, her eyes anxious. "Miss Marple," she said in a low voice, "I must tell you something. The night before Mrs. Price died, I saw Mr. Edward in the study. He said he was looking for a book, but when I came in, he slammed the desk drawer shut. I thought nothing of it at the time, but now, with all this talk of missing money—" Miss Marple nodded gravely. "Thank you, Clara. That is most helpful." Clara twisted her hands. "Do you think he took it, ma'am? He always did have a temper. And he was cruel to his aunt, though she seldom spoke of it. I don't like to accuse, but, well, I thought you should know." When Clara had gone, Miss Marple sat quietly by her fire. The picture was shifting. Edward had motive, opportunity, and the temperament to act rashly. And yet, Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most obvious suspect was seldom the true culprit. Human nature was more devious than that. The following day, Inspector Cray called again. His face was set in grim lines. "We've taken a statement from Clara," he said. "She swears she saw Edward rifling through the desk. That, coupled with his threats at the inn, paints a pretty damning picture." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. "But anger and rash words do not always equal guilt. One must be cautious." Cray frowned. "You don't think he did it?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking steadily, "that faint nick of a man's heel mark still lingered in the earth. Not Edward's broad, heavy step. Not the Reverend's worn soles. Not Violet's dainty shoes. No, this tread belonged to someone more careful, more deliberate." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "We shall see," she murmured. "We shall see." Chapter 7. The Torn Letter. The morning dawned crisp and bright, the kind of September day that reminded Miss Marple of harvest festivals and Sunday teas in the vicarage garden. The air was scented with wood smoke, and from the fields came the faint clatter of a cart. Yet beneath this pastoral calm, St. Mary Mead hummed with unease. Whispers of scandal spread quickly through the narrow lanes. The missing money, the quarrels at the inn, Clara Simmons's uneasy testimony. Miss Marple, seated at her breakfast table with her knitting close at hand, had been musing on the matter when the post arrived. Among the letters was a small note, the handwriting neat and careful. It was from Violet Mayhew, requesting, indeed pleading, that Miss Marple come to the lodge at her earliest convenience. "She is frightened," Miss Marple murmured to herself, slipping the letter into her knitting bag. "Poor child. And when young people are frightened, it is usually because they know more than they ought." She set out along the lane, her umbrella tapping lightly against the gravel. At Hawthorne Lodge she was shown into the morning room, where Violet sat pale and fidgeting, twisting a handkerchief in her fingers. "Oh, Miss Marple," she began at once, "I hardly know what to do. The inspector asked me so many questions yesterday, and I feel as though suspicion has fallen on me." "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, You mustn't distress yourself. The inspector is obliged to consider every possibility. Tell me, why should you feel yourself suspected?" Violet's eyes brimmed with tears. "Because of the drawer. The night Mrs. Price died, she asked me to fetch a shawl from the study. When I went in, I saw that the drawer of her desk was open." Asked softly. Violet shook her head. "No. The inspector searched the desk yesterday, but he found nothing. Perhaps she destroyed them after all." Miss Marple tapped her needles against her palm, a sign that her thoughts were knitting faster than her wool. "Or perhaps," she murmured, "they were taken." That afternoon, Miss Marple sought permission from Inspector Cray to examine Mrs. Price's effects. The inspector, though skeptical, had begun to recognize the value of her observations. He consented with a gruff nod. "You'll find her belongings in the small sitting room," he said. "We've sealed up the desk, but I don't mind if you look. Just don't disturb anything." Miss Marple thanked him and entered the quiet room. Dust motes drifted in the slanting light, and the faint scent of lavender polish hung in the air. She seated herself at the writing desk and began methodically to look. The drawers yielded little: an assortment of bills, some household accounts, a few letters from distant cousins. But in the bottom drawer, beneath a sheaf of blank paper, her fingers brushed against something rough. She drew it out, a torn scrap of blue stationery. Her heart gave a small leap. The fragment was jagged, as though ripped hastily. The writing was bold and slanting, just as Violet had described. She carried it to the window and held it up to the light. The words were few, but significant. "Cannot keep this secret any longer. The money must be accounted for, else." The rest was missing, torn clean away. Miss Marple folded the scrap carefully. Secrets, money, accounting. It was the language of fear and desperation. She recalled the missing sum Mrs. Price had withdrawn, the vanished hoard that had set so many tongues wagging. Could this letter point to its fate? As she replaced the papers, a small detail caught her eye: the faint imprint of writing on the blotter. She bent closer. A magnifying glass, borrowed from the inspector's kit, revealed a partial phrase: "Trust him, or else ruin." Miss Marple straightened slowly. Trust whom? Edward, as the fragment suggested, or another entirely? For what reason? She complained of palpitations, of breathlessness. But, more than that, she seemed, well, agitated, as though she were carrying a heavy burden. I urged her to rest, but she laughed. "Rest," she said, "when I have so much to put right." Miss Marple tilted her head. Did she say what she meant to put right? No, Hale admitted. But she asked me, quite out of the blue, whether a sudden shock might bring on death in a woman of her age. I thought it an odd question. Miss Marple folded her hands. "And how did you answer?" I told her that the heart is a delicate instrument, and yes, a shock could indeed prove fatal. She seemed almost relieved by that answer. Miss Marple studied him keenly. A widow, anxious, fearful, making inquiries about sudden death, hiding torn letters in her desk. And a doctor who now sought to warn her off. "Thank you, doctor," she said at last. "You have been most helpful." After he left, Miss Marple sat long by her fire, piecing together the strands. The torn letter, the missing money, the warning about Edward, the question of shock and sudden death. One thing became increasingly clear. Mrs. Price had feared something. Not merely the future, not merely her nephew's temper, but something more immediate, something connected to those blue letters. The next morning she acted. Calling discreetly at the vicarage, She requested the loan of the parish records, ostensibly for genealogical interest. With the vicar's blessing, she carried the heavy ledger back to her cottage and opened it at her desk. For 2 hours she searched, her eyes scanning line after line of baptisms, marriages, and burials. At last she found what she sought. A marriage, some 30 years past, between Eleanor Price, then a young bride, and a man whose name made Miss Marple's breath catch. It was not the late Mr. Price. It was another entirely. She sat back, her eyes gleaming. "So," she murmured, "that is the secret, is it? That is what the letters would have revealed." The implications were startling. A hidden marriage, a concealed past. And if that past had come to light, ruin indeed. Marple made her way to the vicarage. Morning sunlight filtered weakly through the trees, casting long, delicate shadows. She had spent half the night considering what she had discovered in the parish records. And though her body felt weary, her mind was unusually alert. Reverend Clement received her in his study, surprised by the unusual hour. "Why, Miss Marple, you're up early. I don't suppose you've come to debate the order of harvest hymns." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not hymns, Vicar. Records. I should like to return the parish ledger. It has been most illuminating." The Reverend raised an eyebrow but asked no questions, accustomed as he was to Miss Marple's discreet ways. As she handed the heavy volume back, she noted the faintest flicker of unease in his eyes, as though he guessed she had unearthed something better left hidden. She made her way home, where she found young Clara Simmons waiting anxiously at her gate, cheeks pink from the morning chill. "Oh, Miss Marple, I hope I'm not troubling you. It's just, I've found something." In the laundry basket of all places, she held out a folded square of blue paper, crumpled and faintly damp. Miss Marple's heart gave a small leap. "My dear, where did you get this?" "It must have been put there by mistake," Clara said, flustered. "I was sorting the household things at the lodge, and when I shook out one of the tablecloths, this fell out. I didn't want to give it straight to the inspector, he frightens me so. But I thought perhaps you would know what to do." Miss Marple accepted the fragment with careful hands. The jagged edge matched the piece she had found in the desk. With practiced fingers, she fitted the two together. The writing flowed across the tear, revealing at last the message in full. "Cannot keep this secret any longer. The money must be accounted for, else Edward suspects. And if he learns the truth, all will be ruined." Miss Marple sat very still. The words were stark, their implications grave. The letter was not about Edward's guilt, but about Edward's suspicion. Mrs. Price, or her correspondent, feared his discovery of some hidden truth. "Not I think of this." Cray scowled. "You've more faith in him than I do." "Not faith, Inspector. Observation. Edward blusters, but he does not hide. The guilty, in my experience, hide their tracks most carefully. And speaking of tracks, have you examined the garden path by the lodge gate?" He looked taken aback. "We saw a footprint, yes, nothing conclusive. Perhaps not to the unpracticed eye, but that tread was narrow and deliberate, quite unlike Edward's heavy step. I think, Inspector, you might consider the lighter feet in this matter." Cray muttered something under his breath, but Miss Marple pressed on. "And here is something else you must see." She produced the reassembled letter and laid it before him. The inspector read it twice, his brow furrowing. So the old lady was hiding a secret. Something about money. Something Edward wasn't meant to find out. That gives us a new angle. But who wrote this letter? Miss Marple's voice was very soft. "That, Inspector, is the question upon which everything depends." The following day she took tea with Violet Mayhew in the small parlor at the lodge. Violet, though pale, seemed calmer than before, as though the act of confiding in Miss Marple had lightened her burden. "You've been very good to me, Miss Marple," she said earnestly. "I don't know what I should have done without your kindness." Miss Marple smiled. "Kindness is only common sense, my dear. But tell me, these letters you saw, the blue paper, the bold hand, did you ever happen to see the envelopes?" Violet frowned, trying to recall. "Yes, one or two, I think. They had no postmark, no stamp, as though they had been delivered by hand." "By hand," Miss Marple repeated. "That is most interesting." Violet hesitated. "Miss Marple, do you think the doctor could be involved? He always seems so secretive with Mrs. Price." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said mildly, "but one must not leap to conclusions. Motive and opportunity must go hand in hand. Tell me, do you recall if Mrs. Price ever received visitors unknown to you?" Violet bit her lip. "Only once that I remember. A woman came one afternoon while I was polishing the silver. Mrs. Price insisted on seeing her alone. Records, again, of Eleanor Price's secret marriage long ago. Could the woman be connected to that hidden past? Could the money be tied to debts or obligations never spoken of?" At her gate she paused, looking up at the sky where the first stars pricked through. She felt the shape of the answer drawing nearer. Human nature, she reminded herself, was at once simple and infinitely complex. People lied not only out of greed, but out of fear, pride, or love. And Mrs. Price, it seemed, had lied for years. 2 days later, fortune smiled. Clara, eager to be useful, brought Miss Marple another discovery. A book from the lodge library. A thick volume of sermons by a long-dead bishop. Hidden between its pages was an envelope, unsealed. Miss Marple withdrew the sheet inside. It was written on the same blue paper, in the same bold hand. The letter was incomplete, as though hastily hidden before it could be finished. "Eleanor, I have borne this silence long enough. You must do your duty. The money is not yours to give away. If Edward learns that he is not—" The writing broke off sharply. Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it slowly. Her eyes were grave but triumphant. Here, at last, was the key. The missing words were clear enough to her experienced eye. The letter had meant to reveal that Edward was not what he believed himself to be. Not the rightful heir. Not the true blood relation. The whole edifice of Edward's claim to the lodge rested on a falsehood. Mrs. Price's widowhood had concealed an earlier marriage, perhaps even a child born before Edward's uncle. If Edward were not legitimate heir, then Mrs. Price's will was not cruelty, but justice, a final effort to shield the truth. And someone somewhere had been desperate enough to silence her before that truth could be revealed. That night Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting idle on her lap. The letters spread neatly before her. The threads are often the smoke of a very real fire. At 4 o'clock the company was assembled in the late widow's drawing room. The heavy curtains were drawn, the lamps lit, the air tinged with polish and damp wool. Edward Price loomed by the fireplace, his arms folded, his jaw thrust out defiantly. Violet Mayhew sat pale and fidgeting on a sofa, while Clara Simmons stood near the door, twisting her apron in nervous fingers. Dr. Leonard Hale leaned casually against a table, outwardly composed but with a faint tension about his eyes. Inspector Cray took his place stiffly by the mantel. Miss Marple, neat and small in her armchair, looked from face to face. The atmosphere was taut as wire. "My friends," she began in her gentle, measured voice, "we are gathered here not to indulge gossip, but to lay bare the truth. Mrs. Eleanor Price was not merely a widow of means. She was also a woman with a secret. That secret explains the missing money, the torn letters, and ultimately, her untimely death." Edward gave a snort. "More riddles. If you've something to say, say it, woman." Miss Marple did not flinch. "Very well. 30 years ago, Eleanor Price was married, not to the late Mr. Price, but to another. That marriage, recorded in the parish register, was discreetly concealed when she later wed into the Price family. But its consequence could not be erased. The question of inheritance." A hush fell. Violet gasped softly, and Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Miss Marple continued. "The letters I have pieced together, written on blue paper, delivered secretly, came from a woman who knew of that first marriage. She accused Mrs. Price of concealing the truth and demanded that the money be put right. That money, which Mrs. Price withdrew before her death, was intended as hush money. But before the matter could be resolved, she died suddenly. The secret, however, did not die with her." Edward's ruddy face darkened. "So that's why she cut me out of the will. Because of some blasted scandal 30 years old?" Miss Marple's eyes rested on him with pity. Spinster's blue eyes swept the room. "Consider, Inspector. Who had access to the letters? Who could enter the house without suspicion, deliver envelopes by hand, and counsel Mrs. Price in her anxiety? Who was in a position to know her health intimately, and how vulnerable she was to sudden shock?" Her gaze fixed firmly on Dr. Leonard Hale. The doctor stiffened, color draining from his face. "This is absurd. I was her physician. Of course I knew her condition. But to suggest—" Miss Marple raised a delicate hand. "You, doctor, were the visitor Violet described. You brought the letters not as a stranger but under guise of medical calls. You pressed Mrs. Price to settle the matter, to pay over money to suppress the secret. And when she hesitated, you used fear, telling her that a shock might kill her. The irony, of course, is that it did. Her heart failed, and you were conveniently at hand to pronounce it natural." Gasps filled the room. Clara gave a cry. Edward roared, "The sly devil!" Violet stared, stricken. Hale's composure cracked. "She owed me that money. Years of silence, years of disgrace covered over. I had every right." Miss Marple's voice was quiet but inexorable. "No one has the right, doctor, to take justice into their own hands. You sought to protect yourself by suppressing the truth. But in doing so, you brought about Eleanor Price's death. You may not have raised a weapon, but fear and pressure can be as deadly as any blade." Inspector Cray stepped forward, his face grim. "Dr. Leonard Hale, I must ask you to accompany me to the station." The doctor gave a hollow laugh. "So it comes to this. Undone by an old woman with knitting needles." Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. "It is not I who have undone you, doctor, but your own conscience and your handwriting. Secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply buried." 2 constables summoned earlier entered to escort him away. As they left, silence hung in the room. Edward sank into that the greatest mysteries were not in letters or wills, but in the hearts of men and women. Chapter 10. Morning Tea and Final Truths. The morning after Dr. Leonard Hale's arrest dawned clear and brisk, as though the rain of the previous evening had washed the village clean of its fears. St. Mary Mead's lanes gleamed with puddles that caught the sunlight like scattered mirrors. Sparrows twittered in the hedges, and the baker's boy rattled by on his bicycle with a tune on his lips. In the neat sitting room at the vicarage, a small gathering had been arranged. Mrs. Grayson, kindly vicar's wife, had insisted that Miss Marple should not shoulder the burden of explanation alone, and so she had brewed a pot of her strongest Darjeeling. The vicarage table was laid with toast, jam, and an array of scones. Inspector Cray sat stiffly in one chair, his uniform cap placed precisely on the floor beside him. Edward Price loomed by the window, his face still set in stormy lines, though softened now by bewilderment rather than rage. Violet Mayhew sat with a handkerchief clutched in one hand, her eyes red from crying. Clara Simmons had been persuaded to attend, though she perched uneasily at the edge of her chair as though ready to bolt at any moment. Miss Marple, as calm as ever, sat in the place of honor, knitting bag at her side and a gentle smile upon her lips. "Now then," she said, pouring tea with practiced hand, "perhaps it is time we considered matters in their proper order. An untimely death is always a shock, but confusion and speculation can be far crueler than the truth." Inspector Cray cleared his throat. "I must say, Miss Marple, you do have a knack for pulling threads together, but some of us could use a little more, clarity." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "Let us begin with Eleanor Price herself. She was, as we know, a woman of means, but she was also a woman with a past. 30 years ago, before her marriage into the Price family, she wed another man. It was a youthful union. She hoped to satisfy him and thereby shield her family. But his threats proved too heavy a burden for her frail heart." Violet shuddered. "And all the while he pretended to care for her, her physician, her friend." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "It is a sad truth, my dear, that those closest to us may sometimes use that closeness for selfish ends. Yet let us not forget, Dr. Hale was motivated not by simple greed, but by fear. He dreaded that his own youthful entanglements with Eleanor might be revealed. His professional standing would have been ruined." Inspector Cray nodded grimly. "He's confessed as much. Said the scandal would have ended him." Edward looked up suddenly, his face dark. "But what of me? If she was never truly married to my uncle, then what am I? What becomes of the estate?" There was a pause. All eyes turned to Miss Marple. "My dear Mr. Price," she said gently, "you are, as you have always been, yourself. Nothing can alter that. The law will decide in due course whether Eleanor's estate is to be divided differently. But inheritance, though it matters in the eyes of solicitors, is not the measure of a man's worth. You have lived here, worked here, been part of this community. That is something no will can take away." Edward grunted, not wholly satisfied, yet there was a glimmer of relief in his eyes. Violet spoke up timidly. "And the money, Miss Marple? The thousands that vanished?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Ah, the money. Inspector Cray will confirm that it has been found, concealed in a locked box beneath Dr. Hale's surgery floorboards. He had taken it for safekeeping, intending to return it once he judged the threat had passed. A rather foolish conceit. Fear, you see, makes for poor judgment. Cray confirmed with a brisk nod. We've recovered every pound. Clara let out a long sigh of relief. Then it's over? Yes, dear, Miss Marple said kindly. It is over. Eleanor Price's conscience may its habits. And when Violet described a visitor in the dusk, entering without ceremony, it could only be someone whose presence in the household was unquestioned. A doctor, after all, is seldom denied entry. Cray chuckled grudgingly. I'll say it again, Miss Marple. You'd make a fine inspector yourself. Oh no, Inspector, she said with a smile. I am far too fond of my garden and my knitting. And besides, the law has its own stern duties. I am content merely to notice the small things. Violet's eyes brimmed with tears, but her smile was grateful. You've given us back peace, Miss Marple. I don't know how we can ever thank you. Miss Marple shook her head. There is no need for thanks, my dear. It is enough that St. Mary Mead may sleep quietly again. That is all I could wish for. Later that day, as the company dispersed, Miss Marple walked slowly home through the village lanes. The air was fresh, the gardens fragrant after the rain. Children played marbles on the green, and Mrs. Hartnell's hens clucked contentedly by the fence. Life in St. Mary Mead was returning to its comfortable rhythm. In her cottage, Miss Marple brewed herself a fresh pot of tea and settled into her favorite chair by the window. The late sun cast golden beams across her lace curtains. She reflected, as she so often did, upon the curious ways of human nature. Fear had driven Eleanor Price to secrecy. Fear had driven Leonard Hale to folly. And fear had nearly torn a community apart. Yet truth, though painful, had proved the gentler course in the end. People are much the same everywhere, she murmured, her needles clicking softly. They tell themselves they act for honor or for duty, when, in truth, it is fear they obey. And yet, sometimes, courage comes in the quietest of forms, the courage to confess, to forgive, or simply to begin anew. Outside, the church bells rang for evensong. The sound drifted through the village, steady and reassuring. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her heart at peace. The mystery of the widow's last confession had been laid to rest.